You're listening to the Tahoe Deep Podcast, hosted by Chase Petley and Noah Jeremy.
He said, Donnie, there's things out in this lake that nobody has ever seen.
It's impossible to see clearly or identify what kind of fish it is. Fish researchers said while the animal looks remarkably shark-like,
we found a large fish while we were videotaping at 1,100 feet.
Petley is hoping to expand and refine his project.
In 1976, I was out on Lake Tahoe, and we saw something that I cannot explain.
Chase, why don't you just recap everyone regarding why we think there could be some interesting creatures in Lake Tahoe that people are seeing and claiming to be lake monsters. Let's go a bit over the history of the lake and the interesting characteristics that make it a unique potential habitat for very, very old wildlife.
So as far as the lake goes itself, geology, it started forming about 25 million years ago. And in its current form, it's been around for about 3.5 million years. It's been a safe haven up in the mountains. It's been involved in glacial, volcanic, and fault-blocking formation. Most of that was also really done 3.5 million years ago. So you're seeing a safe haven for life in Lake Tahoe. And I think that warrants just a little bit of extra curiosity from my point of view as far as what could have evolved in that lake and what could exist in that lake. So,
yeah, it's very deep. It's one of the deepest lakes in the world. It's the 14th or 15th deepest in the world. I think it's the second deepest in the United States. It's 1,645 feet deep at least, at its deepest point. And this is just a great visualization here of a skyscraper in the water. It's filled with fault lines, massive fault lines. I don't know what that is. The lake is filled with fault lines. It's filled with caves. There's lots of legends of underground caves and it being connected to other lakes. And essentially, it's a great place. It's so deep that it makes it a great place to survive all the cataclysms of time. And it's got so many faults and caves and everything that it's just a great environment for something to have places to hide, right? Like if you're thinking of a predator, there's no better lake for them to be living and hiding in than Lake Tahoe. Filled with places to hide, filled with food, tons of biomass. It's very deep. It's very old. And it's a pretty constant temperature year-round.
And since you're showing that picture, I have an idea. I mean, another thing that would inhibit life make life possible in Lake Tahoe at a very deep depth. So you see, freshwater life doesn't like to exist where the sun cuts out because there's no stem for its ecosystem. But in Lake Tahoe, you see the fault lines. You can see a little bit of activity there. But on the far left fault and the far right fault, there's proven volcanic activity. Right up there in between the two, slightly to the left of the middle one, you find hot springs. So if we have hot springs underwater, that would actually be a stem for the food chain there.
And yeah, just to reiterate, Lake Tahoe has been in its current form for between 2 and 5 million years, making it very, very old. And there's lots of really interesting life that went extinct in that time frame. But beyond that, the Tahoe Basin itself is over 24 million years old, which opens up the possibility even greater when you consider that Lake Tahoe, Nevada, California were completely under sea for hundreds of millions of years, and the Tahoe Basin and nearby Nevada are just great places to find all kinds of fossils of extinct marine animals. And we'll talk a bit about that later. Well, actually, I guess that's the next slide. So here's some examples.
Well,
I have more later on.
It's weird to think about.
Some of the...
I was just thinking, California's actually been an ocean for much longer than it's been land. And that's kind of a neat thing to perspective look at it. It hasn't been land for that long. It's always been water.
Yeah, and the way Lake Tahoe emerged is the Sierra Nevada mountains started to rise up, and people are getting mad at me for how I pronounce Nevada, so I'll work on it. It's Nevada. Is that right, Chase?
Nevada.
Nevada. Okay, so the Sierra Nevada mountains started to rise up, and the Tahoe Basin involved those mountains separating Lake Tahoe, the region of Lake Tahoe, from the rest of the landmass. And so, my working theory is it was coastal sea, it turned into swamps, and there's probably some kind of lake there already. The Sierra Nevada mountains rise up, isolate this kind of lake or whatever sea ecosystem lived there, and then over times, with over many millions of years, with fresh alpine snow and ice water flooding into the lake, it turned from a salt little body of water separated from everything else to a freshwater lake. And that would have given it plenty of time for any saltwater creature living in that isolated Lake Tahoe basin to adapt to freshwater living. Potentially 24 million years for them to do that. And that's a lot of time for something to evolve. So here are two species of marine... Go ahead.
I was going to say, we have the transitionary. We have lots of species that swim upstream into freshwater to reproduce that actually normally inhabit salt water. So if you have that kind of thing going on, that's usually what causes saltwater life to adapt to salt water. It's when they swim upstream and they get cut off. So we had that going on in the area too, and we know some species that existed millions of years ago while Lake Tahoe is being pushed up, creating the two peaks that cause the valley, which Lake Tahoe resides in now. So it's one plausible reason why you might get some saltwater life inhabiting the freshwater.
I mean, the fact of the matter, the evolutionary fact of the matter, is that basically all freshwater fish came from saltwater. From my understanding, it's all freshwater fish were once saltwater fish a long, long time ago that evolved and adapted over many millions of years to be in freshwater ecosystems, mostly through that mechanism you suggested, swimming up to spawn in freshwater, becoming more adapted to brackish and then fresher water ecosystems. But so two are the big prehistoric species we find in the area. Lots of ichthyosaurs. They're like a reptilian porpoise-looking thing, like a mix between a porpoise and a shark, but it is a reptilian, like related to dinosaurs. We've got Augustosaurus, which is a type of plesiosaur that was found about 140 miles from Lake Tahoe in the mountains, and knowing that when they lived around Lake Tahoe and those mountains were all connected seamlessly by a body of salt water, it makes it intriguing. Of course, I haven't actually heard any monster reports of a plesiosaur in Lake Tahoe, which I might add, I think, makes the monster stories more believable. People think of a plesiosaur when they think lake monster when they hear that term, just because of Nessie and Loch Ness, because that's supposedly the monster there. The legend is of a plesiosaur, but that's not really what we hear about in Tahoe, and we'll talk about that later. That being said, they did exist in the area, and there were lots of extinct sea animals in the area. And why this is important, I think the coelacanth. I was going to say, it's really common.
We have such a lag here, so it's hard to decide where to talk in the gaps. But if you go back to the last slide, I was going to add that we have a localized species of Ichthyosaurus that's found in the region a lot, called Californiasaurus. It survived in the Triassic period. And these things are so commonly found up here, we have companies putting them on their logos. If you're familiar with Sierra Nevada, the beer company, they have a Icky brand of beer. It's a six-pack, and you'll actually see the Ichthyosaurus printed on the six-pack. We have murals up here with Ichthyosaurus. So finding the bones up here is pretty common. I know when they first found them, they thought they found some kind of dolphin. But I don't think it's really too uncommon to find Ichthyosaurus up here buried in the mountains.
So here's just a few pictures of Californisaurus, which is a type of ichthyosaur. And it looks very similar to something we're going to look at later. Let's go back to the slideshow now. So, lots of fossil species. What's interesting, we got Lake Tahoe, which is very deep, very old, and there's lots of fossil species around it. People will come out and say, but things that go extinct, they've gone extinct. Like, clear cut, it's that simple. And it's really not that simple. Here I have an example of what we call a living fossil, the coelacanth. which when I was in school, I was taught that they went extinct 200 million years ago. It has been revised down to 70 million years ago, I believe. But essentially, they thought this was extinct for at least 70 million years until it was caught off the coast of South Africa. And now they've found them. They know where they live. They've filmed them on camera. But what's interesting about the coelacanth is that it lives in very deep water. So if you're thinking about a place where something that went extinct as old as 70 million years, but was then again found in modern day, and you think, why was it found in modern day? Well, it lived in very deep water. So Lake Tahoe is the perfect candidate for a species similar to the coelacanth, the living fossil to be found. So, and that wraps us up with where we're going to start today, which is Tahoe Tessie. Tahoe Tessie, there's a lot of stories. You know, Chase, you've heard a lot. Since posting on TikTok, I get people reaching out with stories. But I've classified it into three archetypes. These are, you can categorize most stories into three archetypical categories. There's a porpoise or whale-like description, like an ichthyosaur or some type of porpoise. There's a kind of silver-scaled, hooked-jawed, gar-like description. And then there's a giant sea serpent, like a shiny, long, black sea serpent. And that is the most common one, at least that I hear. Chase, do you want to talk about these at all?
Yeah, so essentially, after I was on the news, I started getting reports of... I'd kind of subcategories, two of these. So about 5 stories of the top 2. And I'd say about 10 stories of the bottom one. But when I was a complete skeptic, one of the things that kind of tilted me to the other side was the stories were similar in the aspect that it was a fast-moving creature, and shiny always came up, which isn't very typical if you're looking at like a Loch Ness. I never once heard a plesiosaur story, so I don't think anyone's tried to dupe me on that one yet. And then I'm sure, as you're going to show a little bit later, the evidence that we have points to one of those as well.
Yeah, and the shiny quality is very, very interesting. Because just going back to my time in school, I remember taking this very interesting class where we learned about fish camouflage, and the way that fish and predators see in the ocean and in lakes. And shininess is a very interesting camouflage adaptation that's great for water that gets a lot of sunlight. Because when the sunlight reflects off of the shiny scales or skin, the fish essentially becomes invisible to a lot of predators, or very difficult to see at least. And Lake Tahoe is some of the clearest water on the planet. It's becoming dirtier in recent days because of invasive species and pollution, but throughout human history, it has been one of the clearest lakes in the world. And the sun will go down hundreds of feet deep. So you're thinking about something that is hunting, in water where the sun goes down very deep. Having that shiny quality is a great tool to hide itself as a predator and hide itself as potential prey when it's younger or juvenile. So I just think that's interesting that the shininess keeps coming up.
Yeah, and one thing, I'm not a biologist, but I am an offshore ROV operator, so I spend a lot of time looking in the water. And it really reminds me of several predators, but one of them in particular, a barracuda. You've never seen such it's a very shiny fish. Looks like it's made of metal, actually, when you're looking at it. So it definitely correlates with the predators I've seen out in the ocean.
For sure. And so I guess the question is... actually, I just want to mention the plesiosaur point. The fact that we haven't heard any plesiosaur stories. That, to me, lends a lot of legitimacy to the idea of there being some unknown creature in Lake Tahoe. Because when people say lake monster, they automatically, what comes to mind is plesiosaur. I know when I first heard about Tahoe Tessie, I immediately thought plesiosaur. Because that's just the zeitgeist. That's what we hear about with the lake, the Loch Ness stories. And if you look up Tahoe Tessie, you're going to be flooded with all these images of a water dinosaur like a plesiosaur. A lot of you go to a store in Lake Tahoe that has Tessie merchandise. You know, people are wearing dinosaur or plesiosaur costumes. It's plesiosaurs in the store, but that's not actually what people are seeing, or at least most people are seeing. And so
No,
if
they
this
need
is
to get their
something
fish
that's just
stories
made
right.
up in kind of the... Yeah, if this is made up in the consciousness of people, something people are making up or seeing that doesn't exist, you would expect most of the stories to be a plesiosaur, because that is the cultural idea of what a lake monster is in 90% of people's minds. So the fact that that isn't what we see or hear is very intriguing and lends a lot of credence, I think, to the idea that there are undiscovered creatures in Tahoe. And Chase, I think you wanted to make a point about, we use the term lake monster, but we're not talking about something paranormal.
Yeah, I mean, I want to stay close to science as I can here, and we're not looking for a lake monster. We're looking for some kind of species that's yet been discovered. Just like the coelacanth, or, say, the giant squid, or many other species that we found in the last 10 years, it's really just from an absence of looking in deep water. So that's one thing we're going to try to get done here, is prove that there's not a monster in Lake Tahoe, but there is a species that has not yet been found in Lake Tahoe. So...
And going back to like plesiosaurs and Nessie in Loch Ness, which I don't think is actually real. The Loch Ness monster I don't think is real. But let's imagine that a plesiosaur was discovered, Nessie was discovered in Loch Ness. Scientists would look at it and they'd identify, okay, this is this species of plesiosaur. It's not a monster anymore, it's an identified species. We call it a monster because nobody believes that it's real until we've found it and we can get samples of it, right? So we are looking for an undiscovered species, not a paranormal monster. And with that, let's move on.
Yeah, sure.
So we mentioned 3 archetypes. Let's talk about the first, this kind of porpoise ichthyosaur archetype. People described this large creature, very large, with a thick midsection like a porpoise, and a long tail, like wide tail like a porpoise. Smooth skin, no scales. I have a story someone sent me. She swears that she saw a whale tail in Lake Tahoe when she was a kid, and nobody believed her. Now, could just be a kid's imagination. Most likely that's the case. But there's many stories that have come forward of seeing something thick and porpoise-like. Going back to the fossils we have in the area, I think the most likely candidate, if we're going the prehistoric route, is like an ichthyosaur, something like that. But obviously, the most likely explanation is it's a case of mistaken identity and it's some large fish. This is the rarest sighting I've heard about. I've only heard from a handful of people seeing something like this, but we do have a photograph we'll look at later.
Yeah,
and actually, I guess that's the next slide.
Well, it's the first time we get to show this, so that's pretty fun.
Yeah, so this shared with us by a friend, and we'll ask permission if we're allowed to include this in the podcast. If not, we'll bring them on to talk about it at a later time. But essentially, it's a large fish with a large crescent moon fin and 2 kind of pectoral fins that are very, very short and tight to the body. It's got this long ridge on the back and a very thick midsection. You can't make out a head or anything, the front of it, just the back of it. And the story for this goes that a charter captain had people out on a boat, and he went inside to get lunch. They stopped in the middle of the lake, and all of a sudden he hears screams from the tourist passengers. He goes outside, and he doesn't see anything himself, but what the tourists describe is what we have a picture of right here. Now, they didn't take this picture. What happened is when they pulled into port, there were a bunch of canoers pulling in that were white as a sheet and terrified, and they saw this in the same area and took a picture and showed it to the people there, the captain and the tourists. So this is what they claim to saw, and the people on the boat didn't get the picture. Some canoers did, and it's very large. I want to track down the canoers if possible to see how large it is.
Yeah.
But yeah, you look at it, and it looks like it has smooth skin. It doesn't look like it has scales. It has this ridge on its back. And thinking, what could this possibly be? So we talk about things that exist, that we know exist, not crazy. Maybe it's a carp. Maybe it's a catfish. Maybe it's a sturgeon. And then if we get speculative, is it an ichthyosaur that we thought was extinct and is not? is it some kind of freshwater porpoise, which I think is very, very out there. Though, freshwater porpoises do exist. We do have freshwater dolphins, multiple species throughout the world. And here's just a photo comparison for some of those. So, I think if we're going to explain this as something that already exists, like an introduced species, it would be most likely be a sturgeon that was introduced. I've got a picture of a juvenile and an adult white sturgeon there. They do have these kind of ridges on their backs, sturgeon, and at least the adult tail might be able to explain that, and they get very big, sturgeon. So I think that's the most likely explanation for this sighting and sightings like it. I know people have commented and suggested carp or a catfish, but it just doesn't look like that to me. It doesn't have scales, so it wouldn't be a carp. And the fins and stuff, it just look different from the catfish. And I think it's too big for it to be a catfish. I think it's probably a sturgeon, this picture at least. But I wanted to use this as an example of some of the big fish people have seen and some actual photographic evidence. Chase, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, it's hard to get perspective on, number one, the first picture that we shown, which was given to us by a friend of the supposed big lake porpoise. I'd estimate it's kind of hard unless you know waves and you've been around water a lot, what to look for. But I would estimate that to be between 9 and 11 feet. So that can kind of give some people some perspective there. And the other thing is, fish behave in different ways that people really think they do. When you spend a lot of time underwater, you realize that fish don't always swim straight like this. As far as the girl seeing the whale tail, I believe it's quite possible. You know, sometimes fish swim like this. I have lots of examples where they're just kind of floating up and down because they're in a three-dimensional space down there. When you see a tail that's not a whale tail, but it's actually perpendicular with the body going straight up and down, it's hard to think about, but the fish might be going sideways, and what you're seeing is a normal fish tail, but it's up on the surface, resembling a whale tail because it's orientation. But you have to remember the fish doesn't actually care about its orientation. It's in a three-dimensional environment. So there's sometimes where fish that have their tail in the orientation of a normal freshwater fish could resemble more of a mammal, like a whale, where the fish are actually, the tail is actually at a 90-degree angle from that.
Yeah. Very cool picture either way, but I do think this is most likely a sturgeon, probably. I think the ichthyosaur or freshwater porpoise speculation is way, way, way out there. But crazier things have happened.
Well, and you know, too, sturgeon.
Oh.
Well, sturgeon can get, I mean, like, I've been researching it, and they've been pretty solidly recorded at 11.5 feet. So almost 12 feet, you know, for a sturgeon, weighing almost 900 pounds. There's been some crazy reports I've seen of them being 23 feet and up to 30 feet, but these aren't confirmed.
Fraser River.
Oh, yeah.
The Fraser River in BC are huge. There's huge sturgeon in the Fraser River in BC. Why don't I pull some up? Fraser River sturgeon. Yeah, look at those pictures. Like, look at the size of that. 800 pounds virgin sturgeon.
White sturgeon, yeah. And those are white sturgeon, which are actually the smaller of the sturgeon variants. The beluga sturgeon gets larger. So.
Yeah, well, why don't we look at that? That's where caviar, or at least high-quality caviar, comes from. It's the beluga sturgeon.
Yeah. They're actually being hunted to extinction for their caviar.
Oh, yep. But look at the size on that, the head on that puppy.
And one thing that's interesting in the picture you have right there, in the middle of the screen, the black and the white one, what you'll find is the morphology of the fish.
This one?
Two
yes.
up to the right, black and white. That's the same fish. Well, it
So
could possibly
small.
be a representation of the same fish. But the fish's morphology, the shape of its body actually changes as it ages. When they're young, they're very slim and streamlined. And as they get older, they're much more stout. So you got a lot more variance in just one single fish that you could...
Here's a great example of those photos. Just seeing the difference between juvenile and adult morphology. We'll go back to the slideshow. Chase, anything you want to add before we move on to the next fish? Or the next
No.
supposed
Good to go.
monster.
But if we can find a good break in the recording, my computer's plugged in, but I'm getting a battery saving warning. So
Sure. Yeah. Go ahead and plug it back
it's
in.
plugged in. What the hell? Nothing's moved. It just decided it's going to shut itself off. Plug in the right thing. Oh, yep, I had a loose cable.
Okay. We good to go?
Yeah, we're good to go, man.
All right, so this is the next archetype we hear about. This long torpedo-like body, silver scales, big long gar-like snout with very long, sharp teeth, quarter-sized silver scales. That was of course, this is the monster story from Donnie that we showed at the beginning of the podcast. And this one's more common. This is I hear something like this a lot. We have a few stories. I'm going to bring Donnie on to talk about them, but just from what I've heard from people, a lot of stories of people hooking into something silver like this, and it's stripping the hooks flat and throwing the boat around. And the description that people repeatedly use is torpedo-like body, long needle teeth, gar-like snout, large silver scales, medium size, like 12 feet, kind of. And this is the second most common monster sighting we hear. What could it be? This is a drawing that Donnie did. He said that it was at least 12 feet. They were in a 12-foot rowboat boat, and the snout went past the front of the boat and the tail behind the back of the boat. A lot of people are saying sturgeon on TikTok. I don't see it. I know that the morphology is similar to a sturgeon, but the scales are very much different than a sturgeon. He didn't see any barbels. Sturgeon are bottom feeders, and they don't have 2 to 3 inch long needle teeth. I think this is actually the most easily explainable, and it's not far out there at all. I think this is a gar. I think this is either an introduced alligator gar, which we know get up to 12 feet long. Although they mostly live in the south. I don't know if any live in California, but they may have been introduced. Or it's a gar species endemic to Lake Tahoe. Now, if we want to get out there, could be an ichthyosaur, although most ichthyosaurs I've seen are not torpedo-shaped. And another one I heard a lot on TikTok was an extinct giant toothed salmon. Which we have fossils of them, and they're always drawn as having red bodies, and you never know. Supposedly, I'm sure one could have very big silver scales instead of a red body. But I feel like the body shape's a little bit different than the fossils we have of that, but those things haven't been extinct that long. They went extinct about 5 million years ago and lived all over California's rivers and streams. So maybe they do exist in the lake. Maybe that's something.
Well, I've actually seen one on a video game once. Do you have any pictures of what that actually looks like? Do you have that prepared?
Yeah, I'm going to show it later. I have a slide where we'll go back.
I'm curious now.
Yeah. Oh, and I've done this like 6 times today. I forgot, and I made all these slides. Here you go. So here's a photo comparison. So the top is a sturgeon, a juvenile sturgeon, and again, I know it's similar, the flat head, but it just does not really meet the description that Donnie asked. And I sent him pictures of sturgeon after he told us the story the first time, and he just didn't take. But when I sent him the alligator gar picture, he was like, that looks very similar to what he saw. This one doesn't have the super silver scales. I think it's more likely a subspecies of gar that is specific to Lake Tahoe, a cold water gar. But it could be an introduced alligator gar. Fish can adapt pretty quickly. Maybe it's an introduced alligator gar that just with its, phenotypic plasticity has super shiny scales to adapt to that very clear water environment of Tahoe. And then the bottom one is the artist rendition of the giant toothed salmon. So you know what that looks like. And again, it doesn't have the same body shape, but this is also based off of a fossil. It's an artist rendition. You never know if that's exactly what it looks like. And anything you want to add here, Chase, before we move on to the final, most common Tessie?
I mean, really, what I have going in my mind as you're talking about this is Donnie's description and what he interpreted the fish to be. And Donnie, I know him personally. He seems to be a very truthful, honest person. And he has spent so much time out on this lake. I know a lot of people now that spend a lot of time out on the lake, but I don't think I know anyone that spent as much time as him. So his opinions have a little bit more weight with me. And I really believe him when he says 12 feet and all the characteristics that he mentioned. I think that's pretty aligned with what he actually saw. I don't think there's really any kind of exaggeration, or if anything, I would say an under-exaggeration, because he's a pretty logical, skeptical person as well.
Yeah, and especially since we've heard the same story from multiple people, right? Of a silvery fish, big scales. Another story we got from Donnie that I'll bring on to talk about more in depth, because I don't want to butcher it. Someone hooked onto something big, towed the boat a bit, and then the line kind of went slack, and they reeled up a large silver scale on the hook.
I'm jealous. They're going to get to talk to Donnie in a further podcast, but I'm going to be gone. I'm going to be out on the boat working where there's no internet, so I'll be looking forward to seeing that podcast when I get back to shore.
Yeah, it'll be exciting. It'll probably air right before you get back. Cool. So Donnie is agreed to be kind of the guest host of the podcast when Chase is at work. Chase, of course, you want to talk about what you do for work briefly?
Yeah, I think most people have kind of figured it out by now. In my professional career, I'm a work-class ROV operator, an ROV pilot. I drive the big robots that put together everything in the water below where humans could swim. So I spend a majority of my time in a room looking at a screen underwater. So this is why this stuff's pretty familiar to me.
Yeah, and just because we get a lot of confusion, because on TikTok, for example, we post both videos of deep ocean creatures from Chase's work, and then creatures and stuff we filmed in Lake Tahoe, which is freshwater. So Chase works offshore as an ROV operator in the ocean, working on deep sea infrastructure. And he gets some cool videos. His colleagues get cool videos of deep sea creatures that he shares and we put on TikTok. And then when he's home, he's doing some amateur exploration, building his own ROVs and robots to explore Lake Tahoe, which is freshwater. And we also have creatures that we post of that. And I distinguish and clarify in the captions always in the description, but nobody ever reads those. So I constantly am dealing with comments where it's like, wow, there's a big fin squid in Lake Tahoe. I didn't realize Lake Tahoe was 7,000 feet deep. And it's like, no, read the caption.
Well,
anyhow, so
that's another thing I'd like to add too. With my work, I've discovered that I hear all the scientists and videos and everything calling out species and different types of fish and saying how rare they are. Yet I see them all the time. So, as far as something not existing in Lake Tahoe, it's really that you just haven't looked. Like the big fin squid, I've seen twice in just a short period of time, where in all history they only have a few videos of it ever. So
I think there's
it's really
like
just a matter of
13.
looking. Yeah, well, I've done 4 of those now.
Yeah, like they're actually the point is there is a lot of life at depth in the ocean, and we filmed a lot of life at depth in Lake Tahoe. The problem is nobody's going down that deep. It's difficult. As far as I know, Chase, you're the only one that's actually filmed at the bottom of the lake. There's videos on YouTube of people going down, 400 feet. I think there's a video of someone going right to the bottom and then coming right back up. But people aren't spending any amount of time looking at deep water in the ocean and looking at deep water in lakes.
As far as I know with Lake Tahoe, besides me, I've seen one other person take a small ROV type of little craft that they brought to the bottom of the lake. But what they were dealing with, I could tell in the video of them trying to drive that ROV, is they were dealing with a massive length of tether with a really underpowered ROV, and they weren't able to move it very much. So it's basically, they used it like a drop cam, they put it at the bottom, and they pulled it right back up, and they weren't able to explore. I've only personally been able to explore the bottom of Lake Tahoe a little bit, and that's why I'm excited about this summer, when we're going to do a lot of exploring.
Yeah. We're going to ramp things up, because in that short amount of time, a couple hours of footage you have seen lots of life. You've seen fish, you've seen tons of shrimp and life down there. There is so much. Just putting a little more time into it, there's going to be some cool stuff that we find. So that's the 2 archetypes. Just to recap, we've got a kind of, a porpoise, ichthyosaur type archetype that is most likely a sturgeon that has been introduced. There may be a kind that's endemic to the lake. There is the gar archetype, which is most likely a gar, a type of alligator gar. And this is the second most common that we hear about. And then the last one. This is really when you hear the word Tahoe Tessie, when you hear people saying that, this is the creature that should come to your mind because it is the most common, I would say, by a factor of 10 to 1. And that is this black, long, serpentine-like creature.
Yeah, if I had to guess based on the reports that I've gotten, in my mind, we're looking for a very large eel-like creature. So that archetype, I think, is the winner.
Yeah, I think it's a giant freshwater eel species, or maybe not. It might not even be giant. It might be multiple eels just chasing each other, mating, and that's why we see this thrashing behavior, and they're going so fast, and we don't see them very often. They're just coming up to the surface. It's their behavior, what they do when they're mating. I know that a lot of serpent stories in Canada are attributed to muskie, one of our large fish, during breeding season, chasing after each other in a line. They look very serpent-like. So maybe that's what it is. It's just a bunch of eels chasing after each other. Mating, or just chasing after each other to eat each other. Who knows? And
honestly,
yeah, go ahead.
I mean, there could be two creatures. We could have a porpoise-like creature and a serpent-like creature in Lake Tahoe. It's such a vast, unexplored area that there's room for probably two species of unexplored. I mean, I'm almost certain we'll find at least two new species, and maybe those could be them. Yeah.
I think there's multiple, and that's why I categorize them into these archetype groups, because I think there are multiple species that can explain these monster sightings. I think there's multiple species to be found, just like you said. So just to describe the characteristics here, thick anaconda-like body, snake-like swimming, like if you've ever seen a water snake swimming, black and very shiny, or at least very shiny. It's hard to know if it's actually black because a lot of the stories happen at night or dusk, and it could just be a reflection of the darkness. Very long, 20. I have one story where someone thinks it was 20 to 30 feet long. They're very large, and again, this is the most common sighting in the lake. So why don't we think about what this could be? We already talked a bit. Could be fish chasing each other. Could be sturgeon, although I think it might explain some, but I don't think it explains most of these because sturgeon just aren't that thin and that long. Let's speculate. Could be a very large snake, like water snake of some kind, that we thought was extinct and is not. Maybe. Could it be a giant eel species? Maybe. Get far out there. A Basilosaurus, which is a very old whale ancestor.
Yeah. I like how you put some of them in red. I think red means not very likely. Yeah.
Yeah, it means highly speculative, but why not talk about it? It's cool.
Sure.
So I've got some pictures here. That's Basilosaurus right there. It is an extinct whale species. Let me exit out of this quickly.
That's interesting because it kind of covers all the bases there. It's got the gnar-like shape. If you've seen the top half of that, you'd be thinking that could be a garfish or a sturgeon or a Nykiosaurus.
And
but
if you just saw the back,
kind of goes by the serpent thing. Yeah.
If you just saw the back, like the top 10% of the back, it would look like a snake. The tail, of course, is different. The tail makes it unlikely that it would be moving like a snake. But these are the last fossil we have of these are 34 million years ago. So that's when they think they went extinct. Again, Lake Tahoe Basin has existed as a separate from the rest of the world for about 24 million years. So maybe an ancestor or maybe one of these things survived a little longer, and we don't have a fossil from a later time period. And they survived, maybe, very unlikely, I think. And here's some other creatures I have here. I've got a freshwater eel in the bottom left corner, which I think is the body type, is the most similar, but these don't get very big, like maybe 5 feet long at the most. If a bunch of them are chasing each other, could be an explanation. I have a really cool one there. It's called a snipe eel. And it's got this kind of seahorse-like head. And they're very small, but I like to imagine a giant variant of them living in
Yeah.
Lake Tahoe, because I hear people saying like a horse-like head, like serpent body and a horse-like head. So I think that's a kind of cool food for thought. And then the last one I have here is what's called Titanoboa. And this is a known snake that went extinct, but did exist. I forgot to write down when it went extinct. But they think that it primarily fed on fish. And so it was likely, it lived near water at least. Maybe there's some kind of giant sea snake in Lake Tahoe that's living in the caves or the fault lines and comes up for air when it needs to, but just swims in the water and does its thing. I think this is probably the least likely explanation beyond Basilosaurus, which I just think is very much impossible. But large, giant snakes did exist, and let me just look up quickly to see
Could
how
you
long
pronounce
this
the
was.
snake's name again? The Titanoboa?
I think it's Titanoboa, yeah.
Yeah, I googled it. It's 65 million years ago it went extinct with the majority of the dinosaurs. They think.
There you go.
But one thing to add: when you're looking for underwater whale bones, we don't look underwater for bones very often. And with Lake Tahoe, you're getting up to 6 inches in some areas of silt deposited per year. So we have some areas of Lake Tahoe that are under hundreds of foot of silt. So you're not going to find old bones.
Yeah.
Very likely that you're only going to find things that are alive or been alive within the last couple of years.
Sure. And so here we have, they could get up to 42 feet long, Titanoboa. So that's getting up there with more what people are saying. But again, I think it's most likely a kind of eel species. So there's that. And I just wanted to kind of end off this segment. I've got a story to share, an interesting story someone shared with me that I want to share with everyone. But here
And
are
I'd
some
also like to add,
Yeah,
if
go
you
for
have
it.
a story about Lake Tahoe, send it to us. Because unlike in the very beginning when I started off, I now want to hear your stories. I'm actually becoming less of a skeptic. So if you have any authentic stories or video or pictures of what you've seen in Lake Tahoe, send it our way.
Oh, for sure. And we'll feature it anonymously. You don't have to show your face or anything. We'd be happy to feature your voice if you're comfortable with that. We'd be happy to have you on camera talking about it if you're comfortable with that. There are lots of options. If you have a story, share it with us. If you have a family member or a friend that has a story, share it with us or connect us with them so that they can share it. We want to hear these stories. Not just to tell them to other people, but because we're collecting the data and using it for our explorations. We have a big spreadsheet just of what people are seeing, where they're seeing it, when they're seeing it, what time of day they're seeing it, coordinates, or the closest coordinates to where they think they saw it. And that'll all be immensely useful when during the summer, we get down to looking at this with our scientific hats on and trying to figure out what these sightings are. And explain where they are and look if there are new species, look for them. So final slide before the story. These are some prehistoric marine species that lived in the area around Lake Tahoe. Remember, Lake Tahoe, California, Nevada, used to be on like a giant saltwater sea with all kinds of crazy prehistoric marine life in it. Here's some examples that existed in relatively recent time to when Lake Tahoe was formed. Close enough that it's intriguing. Ichthyosaurus, once again, like the shark/porpoise reptile fish. Plesiosaurus, specifically a species called Augustosaurus that lived in about 140 miles. They found a fossil of it from Lake Tahoe. Going back to Ichthyosaurus, Californosaurus is one of those, and they're all around the area. I got Basilosaurus, which is a very long, almost serpent-like whale ancestor. We've got Cedotherium, which is a very short and stocky whale that went extinct very recently during the Pliocene, so between 1.5 and 5 million years ago, which that puts it well within the existence of Lake Tahoe, because
Absolutely.
Depending on who you ask, Lake Tahoe has been in the same state for between 1.5 and 5 million years.
And if I'm not
Basically
mistaken,
unchanged.
you said they actually transitioned to freshwater to do mating, breeding, laying eggs, or it's more of a mammal-looking thing. So I guess giving birth.
Cedotherium, I don't I don't know. I don't think we have.
I'm
that
mistaken, I
information.
guess, what you talked about. Okay. It must have been other species you're talking about.
Well, salmon do this. They go
That's what we were
from
on, I
saltwater
guess.
to
Okay.
freshwater, and that's the next one. The next one is the giant spike-toothed salmon, which people kept mentioning on TikTok. And what's very interesting is this went extinct about 5 million years ago, when Lake Tahoe existed, and lived all over Californian streams and rivers. So if there is a prehistoric species living in Lake Tahoe, this could live there. Like, that would be cool. Anything you
Yeah,
want
I
to add,
guess-
Chase?
You said if there's a prehistoric creature living in Lake Tahoe, I guess this could be it. But I guess if we find anything living in Lake Tahoe, it's not going to be prehistoric anymore. So
True.
I'm excited to see whatever lives down there because we have been videotaping fish. We've been videotaping some odd ones, and I'm sure there's some stuff that lives down there. I'm excited to look. This summer, we have a lot of new equipment and stuff to get out there and get some actual work done. We have people behind us, like biologists and stuff, that are actually on board now. So whatever we do, we're going to show it to everyone, and hopefully everyone's along for the ride. But I'm excited.
Awesome. Yeah, and I'm excited too. And thank you so much, everyone, for listening to this episode. We're going to end it with a story someone shared with me on TikTok. I'm not going to share their name. They wanted to remain anonymous, which is fine. You can believe this, disbelieve it, but someone told me it, and they swore it was true. And they didn't want to be on camera. They didn't want the publicity. So, it was August of 2007. This is from their point of view. We'll call them John. It was August of 2007. I, John, was staying at a resort in Lake Tahoe with my wife. We were standing at the edge of a dock, staring at the stars. It was the evening. Suddenly, my wife asked, "What the hell is that?" I looked into the water, and straight ahead of us, there was a snake-like thing weaving in the water toward us. A feeling of pure terror came over me. We screamed and ran away as fast as we could. We only saw it for a few seconds. It was swimming so fast, side to side like a snake in the water. It was massive, 20 to 30 feet long, I'd say. I only saw the body of it. The head and tail were underwater. I didn't get a good enough look to make them out. It was thick like a giant anaconda. I couldn't make out if it had any color. It was so dark. I've never been that scared in my life. I just wanted to get away.